resurgence of criticisms, particularly in the tech space, is based on this presumption that big is bad.
Yeah.
That because a company is large or successful, they should automatically draw more scrutiny from the government. And that's not always the case, because what we really have to do from a competition policy perspective is take that step back and ask, why are they big? Are they big because they're engaged in some kind of anti-competitive, consumer-harming behavior? Or are they big because they're...
Hello. Welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have on another happy warrior, freedom fighter, someone who's fighting for kids, for their privacy, and also for AI to make sure that we have a prosperous future. And it's none other than Jennifer Huddleston. Jennifer, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks for having me on today.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on, and I'm looking forward to this for a while. So let me go ahead and start with your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it. So Jennifer Huddleston is a technology policy research fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on the intersection of emerging technology and law, with a particular interest in the interactions between technology and the administrative state. Huddleston's work covers topics including antitrust, online content moderation, data privacy, and the benefits of technology and innovation. All stuff we're going to talk about today. You don't want to miss it. Her work has appeared in USA Today, National Review, and many other outlets. Huddleston has a JD from the University of Alabama School of Law and a BA in political science from Wellesley College. So, with all that said, why do you do what you do every day?
I think one of the key things for me is, at the end of the day, I'm ultimately an optimist. And I believe that allowing people the freedom to make their choices is what has allowed us to have so many benefits and so many new ideas and new innovations from entrepreneurs, from creatives, and from consumers interacting with each other, that things are getting better in ways we couldn't have predicted. If we tried to predict what the future would look like, I often, working in technology policy, get asked, what do you think is such and such going to be around in 10 years? Or what do you think the next 10 years is going to look like? And while there are certainly educated guesses we can take, one of the things we've seen, particularly recently with some of the advancements in artificial intelligence and AI, is that allowing people the freedom to innovate, allowing entrepreneurs the freedom to respond to the needs they see, can often create more amazing things than we could have dreamed. And that if we allow people the freedom to be innovators and entrepreneurs, and we remember how much better this has made our lives as consumers, we'll continue to see that there's this case for optimism to be made. A lot of times when we're talking about technology, we hear a lot of pessimism. We hear about all the problems. But if we take that step back and think how much our lives have changed, even in the last 3 years, thanks to improvements in technology, let alone think about, I'm a millennial, and if I go on social media, my understanding is that now means I'm officially old. But, if I think back to the technology I had as a kid when the internet was just coming about versus the technology that's available today, to me as a professional, there have been huge advances that have allowed us to connect with more people, to see how that can allow more engagement on ideas and for businesses of all sizes. And this has been really important. I also look at this as a former teacher. I taught in the rural Mississippi Delta and a bit in Houston, Texas, in a charter school, and seeing the impact that technology can have in a positive way on the lives of young people, particularly thinking about young people in rural regions who might not have the same access to certain opportunities that you would see in an area that's more densely populated. And I think that's one of the other things that really motivates me to remain optimistic about this technology and about our ability to continue to adapt and enjoy these benefits.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the optimism, because you're right. But optimism is tough to come by because of all the pessimism that we have. And I wish we had more of that optimism that's out there. And that's why I enjoy the opportunity to talk to you today about this. What got you to this point? I mean, with the law degree background and everything else that you've been working on, and looking at political science as well, what got you to really wanting to get into technology and looking at AI and everything else?
I found that the intersection of a lot of the issues I really cared about were happening in technology, and that
Hmm.
there was a very interesting conversation to have there. So I've always cared very passionately about issues of online speech or really about free speech. And then you look at the online speech debate, that's where we're seeing a lot of the debate about what does free speech mean in the digital age? How does the First Amendment come into play with various elements around online content moderation? And what are we seeing in terms of things like government job owning? I also was really interested in antitrust and competition issues. I took a class on that in law school. I had kind of come from a law and economics kind of background. It was fascinating to me to really see how we'd seen economics influence the law and really have this kind of objective standard. And
Hmm.
then I've also really been interested in, questions of how do we as a society, not only in societal norms, adapt to new technology, but also with the law and with the administrative state.
Hmm.
How do we see changes when we have something like dockless scooters that don't fit any normal kind of model? What do we see in terms of how we're enabled as consumers to develop our own norms about that? And what do we see both in terms of good and bad policies that can encourage further innovation in the micromobility space, and perhaps policies that, as a result of responses to other sharing economy platforms, are trying to really have a negative impact on those
Hmm.
kind of entrepreneurs.
Yeah, no, it's great, and we wouldn't be able to do this today without Zoom.
Right.
We're recording on Zoom, and so we're able to use access to a lot of IT here, which allows for these great podcasts. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, so I'm glad that we have this now. Also in healthcare, you have AI
Yeah.
that's helping people that are back to the rural areas that don't have access to a doctor. They can go online and do that. That's been a huge improvement. So there have been a lot of benefits to that. But with that said, what do you think are some of the challenges with AI? Just to address kind of the monkey on the back, right? Are they going to end up taking all of our jobs, or what's happening there?
AI is a disruptive technology.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of people who are concerned because there is a technological disruption going on in a way that many of us haven't experienced in quite some time. And so it's not surprising that some people are uncomfortable about it. I think what we need to do, though, is take a step back and really examine what is making us uncomfortable. And is that something where we're all trying to adapt to new technology, trying to figure out what this means for us? Or is this something where we're actually seeing a harm? And
Hmm.
if we're actually seeing a harm, is that harm from the technology, or is that harm from a bad actor using a
Mm.
technology to do a bad thing? In a lot of cases, many of these concerns are actually in that last bucket of bad people using a good tool to do a bad thing. And we have existing laws that can often respond to those concerns, whether it's concerns about fraud or discrimination, where they may already be there. When it comes to kind of that general discomfort, we're seeing it evolve in real time. What are our societal norms going to look like around some of these more philosophical questions around AI? But I think it's also important to remember that technology is a tool. It's something that we use to enhance things, and we want to be sure that we continue to have those opportunities and we don't let our fears get in the way. I often think about, I went to law school in an age of the internet, of being able to do legal research and whatnot using all these online databases. And my parents are both academics,
Mm.
and in their training. And I remember like talking to them and just thinking, how did you do this
Hmm.
quantity of deep level research in any kind of timely fashion when you had to go and find the journal, and then you probably had to interlibrary loan this issue of the journal because your, you know, library didn't have it and things like that.
Yeah.
That for many of us, we saw this with the internet where it brought all this information together and we look at it like how wonderful this is. And I can't imagine a day and age without, being able to have this kind of tool for research or for entertainment or things like that. I think with AI, what we're seeing is a similar transition happen in some ways of are there people who are concerned about job loss? Will there be industries where this disruption occurs more? Yes. But will it also lead to an evolution of
Mm.
those jobs? We don't say you shouldn't be able to do the internet use the internet to do legal research or academic research because there probably were certain displacement factors that occurred. Instead, we look at how the jobs changed, whether it's the legal jobs themselves or the academic jobs themselves, or is it, an evolution of things in that regard? So while I think we should, at this phase particularly, continue to think about AI as a tool and how can we potentially integrate it, and also realize that many of us have been integrating it a lot longer than we realize. If
Mm,
you run search engines, if you've used autocomplete, if
yeah.
you've, you
Yeah.
know, I always hate that question of, well, how often do you use AI? It's like many of us have been using AI on a daily basis, but
Right.
because we're so used to it and we use other names for it, we don't call it AI anymore.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, and then it seems scary, right? If you say AI or something, but otherwise it's not scary. I kind of like it whenever it does the sentence, and I can choose whether or not to use it or not, or
Exactly.
change it up. In my car, I love using GPS and moving around. Just I think about whenever I was driving around 16 or 17, 18, and having to use a map to drive across Texas or wherever else I wanted to go. I don't have to worry about any of that now, which is nice. And so there are a lot of benefits that we get from these things. And one of the things that I think is important to highlight, which you did, was that there will be some cost, right? You have concentrated costs, but dispersed benefits from AI, different technologies that come out. I mean, and you're right. There have been so many things that have come up, whether it's the horse and buggy going to the two model car, or whenever the internet first came out, that was going to take over all the jobs. And now people seem really concerned that AI is going to take over our jobs. But instead, I like the word you used, the evolution. It's going to evolve into other types of jobs that they could do that we don't even know today. Some of the ones who are more pessimistic about AI, I think they get into a situation where they're not having a growth mindset. It's more of this static mindset where it goes into, maybe we don't know what the future is going to hold. So how can you have that amount of knowledge to know that it's going to hurt us in some way? Why not let markets work? Imagine that, free markets and work to see what's going to work and what's not. Adam Thier talks a lot about permissionless innovation, which I like a lot, where you allow for the innovation to take place and let supply and demand work its way out, instead of the first line of defense seems to be too often now, Jennifer, is the government should come in and regulate it. Is that kind of what you see as well in your work?
It's what we've seen for a long time
Yeah.
in Europe, this much more precautionary approach of
Mm,
regulate first, make technology innovators, entrepreneurs prove that they're 110% safe, that nothing could go wrong, come to the government, get the government's permission, and then maybe we'll let you onto the market,
yeah.
kind of a approach. And what we've seen is the impact that's had in Europe. This is not the only reason, but it is a key reason why we don't see a real startup culture, why we have seen, this impact extend even further with laws like the GDPR, which is a very requirement heavy privacy
Mm,
regime. There's a lot of debate about whether it's even actually improved privacy at all. And now what we're seeing is in the US, where we have much more traditionally around many of these general purpose innovations, particularly. And I think that's key with
mm,
AI. When we're talking about AI in this kind of conversation, we're talking about it in its general purpose sense.
yeah.
There are going to be some very industry specific questions around applications of AI and some very, specific types of AI that may get discussed differently. But like the internet, AI is a general purpose technology that has many applications, some of
Mm,
which we don't even know now. And so one of the things the US got right about the internet is it basically presumed the internet innocent until proven guilty. When you look at kind of our mid 90s internet policy, things like Section 230, things like the Clinton framework for global electronic commerce that really allowed the internet to take off both as an economic force, as a force for speech, and really allowed this kind of broad innovation. One of the key things there was this kind of presumption that innovators can do until we've told them otherwise that they cannot. We
mm,
saw comments, in legislative speeches about we don't want a federal computer commission. Concerningly, now we're starting to hear some of the opposite in some cases. We are starting to hear calls for a federal AI commission or calls for licensing for AI and things like that. And I think what we should be doing is looking at what did we get right with the
mhm,
internet that really allowed the US to be one of the leaders in this innovation and in this technology that we can apply to AI and
Yeah.
move forward because we know that approach has been successful in the past.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and recently there's been this the Biden administration has put out an executive order on AI, and I wonder what your thoughts are on it. Of course, coming out of the Biden administration, it's usually like, well, we're going to have more regulations, we're going to have more things that are going to tie things up. But I wonder if you found any positives that may be in there as well. But I wonder what your thoughts were overall.
I think this was a huge signal that we are seeing potentially a more regulatory approach to
Hmm.
AI from this administration, that we are continuing to see something that is likely to presume that there's a need for government intervention here. I think there's an additional concern that we're seeing this done by executive order at a time when we do know Congress is actively debating this, when we do know Congress is trying to really listen and learn. They're hosting these AI insight forums so that they can have a better understanding from experts in industry and civil society, in state government and things like that, of what is going on, how might they want to approach this. And so with the executive order, I think one of my key concerns is, how has this shifted this conversation,
Mm,
because to something that is going to be much more regulatory and much more relying on government intervention.
yep, yep. It's interesting too because I'm not sure if some of the Republicans and a Republican administration might not do something similar. Because you're seeing this from the right and the left too often. Yeah, I worked at OMB in the Trump administration, and there was a lot of deregulation that was happening. But at the same time, there were some things where they were talking about regulating more, and I'm not so sure if it would have been much different. Maybe a few things here and there, but I wonder what you think.
So I will say in that particular example, there was an AI policy during the Trump administration.
Okay.
It often is forgotten about because
Yeah.
many of us like to think AI just popped up about a year ago
Yeah.
when ChatGPT went popular, but it was very much intended to be kind of a presumption of how should agencies look at how they can incorporate this? What
Mm,
would that encouraging American investment in this technology that's likely to be critical going forward approach? And because a lot of these conversations were happening in like late 2019, early 2020, and then
mm.
some other kind of things went on
Yeah.
in
Right.
2020 that took a lot of attention. I think there wasn't as much attention paid to what that policy would look
Yeah.
like. Then in 2022, you suddenly have the rise of generative AI in a kind of
Mm,
consumer facing way. And so all of this kind of, when it was looked at more in the background, when we were looking at more of those industry specific approaches in healthcare, approaches and how this could potentially improve government, you had an ability to take that step back and really focus on the benefits, versus now you have a lot of people that are focusing on their fears instead.
Good discussion there. Speaking of fears, another thing I wanted to talk to you about was on antitrust, which I know is one of your great hobbies that you love to work on. I think we're getting a lot of push again from the left and the right for more regulation, to going after a lot of the quote unquote big tech companies, the big sandwich shops
Yes.
now, as Senator Elizabeth Warren recently said. But that's not it, right? I mean, there's a lot about mergers and acquisitions. I mean, there's a lot of talk from the Biden administration, from some of the key contenders running for the Republican candidacy for president. I mean, this is across the spectrum. There's a lot of hearings in Congress talking about this as well. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on antitrust in general, and how do we keep the consumer welfare standard to being the core of this?
I love the consumer welfare
Yeah.
standard. I think it's a great legal standard because it provides an objective, largely economic based model for which to analyze what is often a difficult question. Because some of what you mentioned, this kind of resurgence of criticisms, particularly in the tech space, but not always limited to the tech space, is based on this presumption that big is bad.
Yeah.
That because a company is large or successful, they should automatically draw more scrutiny from the government. And that's not always the case, because
Mm,
what we really have to do from a competition policy perspective is take that step back and ask, why are they big? Are they big because they're engaged in some kind of anti-competitive, consumer harming behavior? Or are they big because they're providing a product that consumers like? Are
Right.
they big because they were the first one to figure out how to do something and other companies are playing catch up and, in another year or two we'll have 15 video conferencing softwares instead
Yeah.
of 3,
Yeah.
kind of thing and things like that. Are they big because they're responding better to consumer needs or things like that? There are a lot of reasons companies can be big and successful that have nothing to do with things that should draw attention from the government and are in fact things we should applaud entrepreneurs for
Mm.
for finding those consumer demands. The mergers and acquisition question, particularly in tech, has kind of centered around this idea of a kill zone. The idea that somehow small companies, if they're going to likely be competitors, are just snapped up by large companies in order to prevent them from ever becoming a new threat. But I think that really misunderstands the complicated dynamics that can go on in this industry. There are some folks who really just want to be serial entrepreneurs. They want to create a product, launch that product, move on to the next product. They're not necessarily interested in kind of continuing to grow and be that business, and selling that product to someone else may be the best solution.
Mm.
There are other people where what their product actually is something that makes an existing product better. And
Yeah.
it may be that the best way to get that to a large consumer base is to integrate it into that existing product. And then there are the people who are doing really disruptive things, who are going to challenge the big guys and are going to be that kind of next household name. But that's not a guarantee either. And that's often a very hard road and has a lot of difficult questions. And so I think making sure that entrepreneurs of all sizes have that choice when it comes to what their quote unquote exit strategy looks like
Mm.
from their company, because as consumers, those strategies can all benefit us in
Mm.
different ways.
Yeah, great points. And when we're looking at these things, I think a lot of them that are pushing for this are pretty radical. Not even pretty; they are radicals. Like Lena Khan. You have the DOJ coming up with their views on what's happening. I think there are some also on the right that are radical about this as well. To where, yes, they want to go after the big. I think on the left, it's more about, well, they're too big and they feel like they're having too much profitability and they don't like profitability and income inequality and all these other things that they'll put into their function, into their formula, and say, you know what, this is wrong. But I see it from the right, coming from a matter of, well, I don't like the policies that they're putting out, or I don't like the wokeness of these firms, and so let's go after them. And I think, to your point, that's where the consumer welfare standard comes in and says, well, both of these are pretty subjective. We need an objective metric to set the path forward so that we do have competition in the marketplace. Because it's interesting, they'll talk about, well, big tech is a monopoly, but then they'll talk about the different companies that are really leading it. Well, that's not monopoly. And when you think about Amazon, why do they have so much market share? Because people like their product, they like their service of getting their stuff at their door when they want it, and it's in good condition and everything, compared to using other services. And so it goes to your point, consumers have a lot more sovereignty than I think many people give them credit for. We can choose not to use them. We don't need the government coming in and regulating it away and choosing for us in the process, and taking away something that could be really good for us. And so I think this could be a really big problem if we don't get control over it. And I wonder, how do you think we can get control over it? I mean, do we need legislation from Congress to say, you know what, we don't need to get into this, we need to verify it, or is it going to come up to the Supreme Court and this court's going to finally rule something, or what do you think is to be the next steps there?
Well, the good news is we have so far seen these radical theories lose in the courts. We
Yeah.
have seen the courts retain this objective standard, not really allow some of these kind of subjective measures or subjective theories on what the market could potentially one day might be if squint or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, to succeed. So that's the good news in the immediate term. We have seen proposals in Congress to change the antitrust laws, and I think one of the big concerns there,
Yeah.
to your comment about this oftentimes being a bipartisan push, is these are not going to stay just in the technology sector. I can talk a lot about why I think they're bad for the technology sector, but if you're someone who presumes that it's okay to do this in one sector, these laws do not only impact one sector. You're
Yeah.
potentially giving the government a very powerful sledgehammer into almost every sector of the American economy.
Hmm.
And we laughed a little bit about this at the start of this section, but the recent tweet by
Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, that was roughly something along the lines of we need to investigate Big Sandwich. It shows that if you think that this would only stay in the tech sector, it very quickly is going to go farther. And I think that there should be a similar concern about some who are suggesting that we do target the tech sector. As you mentioned, we
Yeah.
continue to see robust competition. What we also often underestimate is that innovation is often our best competition policy.
Hmm.
If we're only looking for the next Google, the next Facebook, the next, whatever, we're
Yeah.
often going to miss what actually is changing. It's
Hmm.
very interesting to me. We're having this conversation at the time that AI is causing so much disruption.
Yeah.
By the time, these cases that take a very long time work their way through the courts. And this is what we've seen in the past, even with cases like the Microsoft case that is often pointed to. By the time these cases are settled, oftentimes our technology conversation has moved on to a
Hmm.
completely different
Yeah.
iteration. And I think that's important to remember as well. When it comes to some of the subjective things we hear antitrust called to be used for, whether it's content moderation
Hmm.
or privacy or things like that, antitrust is a very specific tool in that it's designed to be used for competition policy. If we
Hmm.
start allowing these more subjective, policy focused elements into it, again, think about the person you most disagree with having the power to dictate to the players in an industry what their policies had to be or launch one of these investigations into it. And is that something you really want coming from the government? No matter how much you like or dislike a company, is that, don't think about the person you most agree with. Think about the person you most disagree with
Yeah.
having that power.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Great point. I also kind of fear some of that too, because they'll, this idea that if we just have the right people in charge, they can make the right decisions. And we're hearing that going back to the populism thing that was on my mind earlier, is you get a lot of that from the left and the right now too, the NatCons and everything else happening. I'm worried about that situation, but I think it's a good segue to kind of what the last few minutes we have here is to talk about these social media bills and this concern about social media, especially for kids, right? Being on social media. My concern has been is look, maybe there's some issues here. I think the research on this is mixed. I don't think that they're finding significant findings that social media is creating the depression and causing the suicides. There's more correlation than causation, but we get that entangled a lot in our debates and in the public sphere. But the bigger thing to me is I really think, and kind of goes back to what we're talking about here, is too often we want the government to be the first line of defense when I think it should be the last line of defense. That's with welfare policy. That's a lot of different things. But here, to me, it seems like parents should be the ultimate decider on whether or not their kids should be on social media, have more engagement with what their kids are looking at. And there's a lot of apps. There's a lot of security now that you can do. I've got 3 kids. None of them are on social media yet because they're pretty young, but I've been looking into it and learning from the industry and everything else about all the tools that are already available of the innovation that's taking place. And I'm concerned, Jennifer, about if government comes in and keeps regulating, like Texas had a bill that passed, Louisiana had a bill, Utah had a bill. There's all these bills dealing with social media that it may hinder a lot of these kids in the future from learning about things online, from being open to it whenever they get into a job and a career in the real world that will be using a lot of these, and they wouldn't have learned the good insights from maybe their parents. Imagine that, of how to use this and how to do it right, and having someone to talk to, because now the pressure and dependency has been on government. But I wonder what your thoughts are on this, and anything you'd like to add.
Being a parent in the 21st century is difficult.
Yeah.
And I certainly understand that a lot of parents is right. Their first instinct is how do they protect their children? And so a lot of them have heard negative stories. They may have had negative experiences themselves, and they're looking for questions of how can they make sure that their children don't have to go through those negative experiences or make them better. You mentioned you have 3 kids,
Yeah.
and one of the things I always think about with this issue is when I talk to my friends who have multiple children, each kid they're gonna have a different concern about. So
Yeah.
for one kid, it may be the amount of time they're spending on a device, and for one kid, it may be a particular interest that they're worried might lead them to certain types of concerning content, whether it's violence or body image or things like that. And for another kid, it may be, I trust the kid, but I know that they have a lot of online gaming friends, and I want to
Mm.
know who those people are, things like that. Of when you even ask people, what are you concerned about young people online? You're likely to get very different answers,
Mm.
even within the same family, that require very different solutions. The good news is we've seen, because the industry knows parents are concerned, a lot of response in creating different tools, whether it's parental controls that provide time limits, whether it's ability to filter out certain content, whether it's just an alert of, hey, your kid sent X number of messages. That's something that we've seen happen, or an ability to make your kid's account private, or changes that at certain platforms that default young people's accounts to private unless they or their parent change it to public. So I do think we are seeing a market response that can help families respond to the variety of concerns that they may have around young people and technology use. The problem when we start doing this at a government level is
Yeah.
that you have a one size fits all approach.
Yeah.
So if you're either going to end up with something that's really restrictive, that maybe all you were concerned about was wanting to know how much time your child was spending on their tablet so that you could respond accordingly. Or, if it's been 2 hours, okay, you have to at least come ask me, so that maybe if you're reading your book on your Kindle, I want to let you keep going. But if
Right.
it
You're right.
2 hours of Angry Birds, I want to tell you go outside and play with your brother,
Yeah. Yeah.
then, that a parent can make those choices versus the government dictating this is the way it has to be, whether it's a certain type of content or a certain amount of time limit. The
Yeah.
other really interesting thing with these laws that I often think is important to remember is the only way to prove, because many of these laws require more active verification. So
Mm.
not just putting in your birthday the way you do now, but things that would likely require some sort of either biometric face scan or uploading an ID to verify that someone is actually who they say they are. And the only way to ensure that someone is not under the age of 14, 16, 18, whatever age is set by these laws,
Yeah.
is to verify that everyone is also over that
Right.
age. So
Right.
this is not something that's only going to impact young users. It's something that's going to impact all internet users. And what does that mean for key issues around things like anonymous speech that have
Mm.
been a long held First Amendment protected tradition in the US? What does that mean for who has access to
Mm.
that data? What does that mean for the potential concerns about government having access to that information, or the cybersecurity of that information? So I think
Mm.
that's key to really remember as well. And then
Yeah.
finally, to your kind of point about, unfortunately, it seems like in many cases, people are kind of going to government intervention first.
Yeah.
I think there's a real opportunity, particularly in this space, for education over regulation.
Yeah.
So, how can we help parents better know what those resources are out there? Kind of your child just brought home an iPad from school. Here's what you may want to check. Your child just downloaded this app. Here's what you may want to consider.
Yeah.
And there are some great civil society groups that provide that information. There, in addition to what's available on apps themselves in terms of parental control features, there's also some great information out there about how to have conversations with your kids around technology in general, how to reconsider how your own technology use around your children may be impacting them. Are you on your phone all the time at family dinner
Yeah.
as well? And so, if it's okay for mom or dad, is it okay? Why is it
Right.
not okay for me? Kind of conversations, and having what at times may be difficult conversations.
Yeah.
I think the final point there too is that we also have to consider, what about children that are in some really unfortunate situations
Yeah.
where the internet is a lifeline? What about children where they're in abusive homes and being able to find help through services about a parent who may be having an overdose or something like that? if a kid needs to go to the internet to check something and or is looking at a, what should I do about this situation that's going on in my house, they're probably not going to be able to go to mom or dad and ask them to take off this feature to let
Yeah.
them go. And in some cases, there are also real friendships. We sent all of our, we sent many young people home and told them to stay connected during the pandemic and everything. And they probably formed some real online communities that need to that for a kid who may feel again isolated in their own environment, that may be critical to in a beneficial way to their mental health as well as all the times we talk about the negatives,
Yeah.
not to mention all the beneficial uses we can see young people doing with social media, whether it's gaining their own voice at a younger age than, any newspaper would let them have a column on books or
Yeah.
politics or whatever, or whether it's, being able to be entrepreneurs and creating programming themselves or illustrating their or showcasing their artwork or selling
Mm.
products on Etsy. All of these are opportunities that young people currently have because of the ability to engage with user generated content online, that in the case of some of these bills would make it much more difficult, if not impossible, to do that.
Yep. Yep. That's true. Great words there. And I think kind of what captures a lot of what we talked about is kind of the seen versus the unseen, whether it's AI, whether it's antitrust, whether it's social media, and what the effects, the unseen, right? The effects of all these policies have on our today and on our future. And so I agree with you. I'm also an optimist. It's tough sometimes given the situation that we live in, but I know that good people are working on these issues like you every day, and that we'll continue to. And of course, civil society and private sector will continue to flourish along the way, unless government gets in the way too much, which is what we're trying to fight to let people prosper. So, in closing here, are there any other things that you like to mention before we go?
I think that it's, going to be a really interesting time to watch what's going on, that there are a lot of potentially beneficial opportunities as well. And I think that's the key here. We spend a lot of times talking about the pessimism
Hmm.
around technology. And as you kind of alluded to at the beginning, it's easy if all you see is headlines to think that we're barreling down to some dystopian science fiction future.
Yeah.
But I think if we take that step back and think about how much better our own lives have gotten and how much technology has played a role in that, and what are the trade-offs to the
Hmm.
kind of seen and unseen? What are the trade-offs of things we would be giving up, whether it's values like free speech or whether it's just the things we've gotten used to, like being able to have GPS on our phones
Yeah.
when they're fresh out of the box, understanding, that there are trade-offs involved and that most often we want to let ourselves be and other consumers be the one to decide those trade-offs, not a government dictate.
Yep. Amen. I agree. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for all the work that you're doing, and God bless you and your family. And forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. And for the audience, please go and give us a 5-star rating and a review, and share this with your friends and family. There's a lot of good information that we talked about today, and I'll have this all on our show notes page at vanceginn.com or my Substack, vanceginn.substack.com. And until next time, let people prosper.